In this video, we're going to touch upon the concept of inverses again. So what I want you to title this is Inverses, and we're going to call it Part 2. Okay, so we're really going to some more details and nuances of the inverse of functions. All right, so generally speaking, when we write a function, we write f of x, right? And we associate that with the letter y. In other words, x is the input and y is the output. Now, when we do the inverse, if you recall, we switch x and y. So when we switch x and y, we would write the inverse as f inverse of f inverse, right? That. But remember, what that means is, since we're switching x and y goes in here and x goes in there. And just to clarify, this y over here was basically what was in the original function. And this x over here, what was in the original function. So in other words, the x becomes like a y, and the y here sort of becomes the argument over there. In other words, the input over there. So we just switch the inputs and outputs, and that's really what it means. So let's say, for example, I have some point which is, say, f of 1 is equal to 2, right? So in other words, x is 1 and y is 2. Now, if I were to draw the inverse function, how would that change? Well, since the inputs and outputs change, f inverse, this would become 2, and that would become 1. In other words, they just switch places, right? So let's do another example. So say, for example, I have f inverse, oops, sorry, not f inverse, but let's say I have f of 3 equals 4. I'm just making this up. So then if I were to write, what is f inverse of 4? Well, that's simply equal to 3. So I hope you realize that if you just write something in one way, f of 3, we can rearrange that and speak of the f inverse by simply switching the input and output. All right? So let's look at an example of this just to clarify what we mean. So say, for example, here is f of x. So pause the video if you want and sketch this over here. And basically, there's sort of 3 points on this f of x function, which are 1 and 2. So 1, 2. The second one is 2, 3. So 2, 3. And the last one is 3, 5, which is 3, 5 over there. All right? So make sure you write that down. And then now I'm just going to throw some questions at you, and so let's see if you can answer them. So based on this, so again, this is just an example. So let's say if I ask you, what is f of 1? Well, this is just our standard function, so input of 1, and therefore the output is 2, so this is simply equal to 2, right? Let me ask you this, what is f of 3? Well, if I look at 3, so here's the input, 3, and now the output is 5. So if I say f of 3, that is simply equal to 5. All right? Now let's look at C. So this one's going to be a little bit different. What if I did f inverse of 3? So what is this equal to? So keep in mind now, when I do the inverse, the x and y switch. So previously, whereas this 1 and 3 over here were the inputs for f of x, for f inverse, this 3 is the output. So in other words, instead of looking from x to y, we're going sort of the opposite direction. We're looking at 3, and we're trying to find the corresponding input. So for 3, this is equal to 2, right? Let's do one more. So let's say if I did, what is f inverse of 5? What this means is now I'm looking at the outputs. So in other words, here, because it's an inverse, it's the exact opposite. So 5, I'm just looking right there. And what is the corresponding input? Well, it's 3, right? And if you just wanted to confirm, just based on this, if you're confused by that, just based on this XY table, right? We can see that, for example, here, f of 2 is equal to 3. And based on our logic before, since we can just switch the x and y's, f inverse of 3 is equal to 2, which is exactly what we see right here, right? And similarly, over here, if we take a look at this, we see f of 3 is equal to 5, and so if we do the inverse of it, f inverse of 5 is equal to 3, which is exactly what we see over here. So I hope that made sense. This is a very, very important concept that just comes up again and again, which is if you have one coordinate, so if you have f of 1 equals 2, sometimes you need to know how to switch it into the inverse form, or vice versa, where you have, let's say you have the inverse form, how do you switch it into just the f form without the inverse? In the next video, we're going to go over another example of this.